Mirror Talk Episode 12, The Blame Game, Projection, Accountability, and the Language of Defense. Welcome back to Mirror Talk, the language of the nervous system. Today we're going to explore the blame game. Blame is a story our nervous system tells before our consciousness can catch up. It's the reflexive flick of language that says, it's your fault, when what we really mean is, I can't hold this feeling. In that split second between stimulus and response, the brain does something ancient. It protects the self by projecting discomfort outward. And for a moment, that projection feels like safety, but like most temporary shelters, it doesn't hold for long. When we blame, we speak not only from belief but from biology. The words that leave our mouths carry the residue of adrenaline, cortisol, and fear. They're survival scripts disguised as sentences, a way to offload emotional heat when the body feels it cannot stay with its own intensity. And when we are blamed, we hear not only accusation but alarm. The nervous system recognizes threat long before the mind registers words. Blame, in essence, is language under duress. In this episode, we explore how the act of blame emerges at the intersection of linguistics, psychology, and physiology, how tone becomes defense, and phrasing becomes armor. We'll trace how projection serves as an unconscious mirror, reflecting the emotions we disown, how accountability, when spoken gently, can restore trust in the self, and how the nervous system translates responsibility into regulation. Because to understand blame, we must see it not as a moral failure, but as a misfired attempt at safety. The nervous system behind the word, you, the moment the word you leaves our lips in conflict, something subtle but measurable occurs. The body shifts, heart rate quickens, shoulders rise, the diaphragm tightens. It's the sympathetic nervous system mobilizing, preparing to fight. Polyvagal theory helps us understand why this happens. When we feel misunderstood, cornered, or criticized, our ventral vagal system, the network responsible for calm and connection, begins to shut down. In its place, the body recruits survival circuits, the dorsal vagal freeze, or the sympathetic fight-flight response. Language becomes weaponized breath. The you statement, you always, you never, is not simply a phrase, it's an embodied discharge. The tone sharpens because the throat muscles contract. The rhythm accelerates. After all, breathing has shortened. From the perspective of NSL, nervous system language, every accusation is a physiological event. Meanwhile, the listener's mirror neurons register the same tone and body cues, activating their own threat response. The nervous systems synchronize, but not in empathy, in conflict. This is how arguments escalate, not because of disagreement in content, but dysregulation in cadence. When we see blame through this lens, we start to ask a different question, not who's right, but whose body felt unsafe first. The mirror of projection in the linguaver, we describe projection as a mirror turned outward. It's a linguistic phenomenon as much as a psychological one, the moment when words become vessels for unowned emotion. Projection is the syntax of avoidance. You're so angry, spoken by someone who cannot face their own rage. You don't care about me, from the one who has withdrawn inward first. Carl Jung once said, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. From a neuropsychological perspective, that irritation is data, a sensory signal indicating resonance between one nervous system and another. The anterior cingulate cortex, which processes both personal pain and perceived social rejection, lights up in the same way when we feel accused as when we accuse. In both cases, the body is trying to externalize discomfort. The mirror linguistic hypothesis, MLH, frames this as semantic displacement, when our language directs emotional energy away from self-reflection and into external expression. It's easier to verbalize discomfort than to metabolize it. The brain prefers clarity, even false clarity, over ambiguity. Blame provides a quick narrative that soothes cognitive dissonance. But every time we do this, we also erode the bridge between reflection and responsibility. The comfort of certainty blame thrives in certainty. To say it's your fault is to temporarily reclaim control in the chaos of emotional overwhelm. Certainty is the nervous system's painkiller. It numbs complexity. Yet, the deeper the certainty, the shallower the understanding. When we speak from certainty, our linguistic range narrows. Words become binary, always, never, right, wrong, good, bad. These polarized structures reflect neural rigidity. Studies in affective neuroscience show that when emotional arousal is high, the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for nuance and empathy, temporarily downregulates. We literally lose access to complexity. From the MLH view, this is where language becomes a mirror of mental state. The grammar of certainty, you should have known, it's always like this, is not just cognitive laziness, it's a nervous system bracing for impact. Each polarized phrase carries a somatic signal. I need things to make sense again. And yet, it's through uncertainty that the relationship grows. Dialogue requires the nervous system to tolerate dissonance, to stay regulated in the presence of not knowing. That's why blame feels seductive. It offers relief from ambiguity. But real safety can't be built on the back of accusation. Offense as dialogue. When we analyze the language of conflict, We often assume that words reflect thought, but in many interactions, words reflect state. The defensive comment is a nervous system trying to regain equilibrium. It's not about logic, it's about safety. In relational neuropsychology, blame functions as state communication. The body, overwhelmed, sends out an SOS through tone and phrasing. The words might sound accusatory, but beneath them lies a plea. See me, understand me, help me regulate. This is where MLH and NSL overlap. Mirror neurons are not just visual, they respond to auditory tone, pacing, and rhythm. When someone speaks from agitation, your nervous system resonates with that agitation unless you consciously downshift your tempo. Thus, the counterblame, "You're doing it too," isn't intellectual mimicry, it's nervous system contagion. True dialogue begins when one person remains embodied enough not to mirror the defense. When tone softens, breath lengthens, and pacing slows, it sends a signal of safety. Only then can accountability replace accusation. Cultural mirrors of blame. Every culture teaches its own grammar of responsibility. In some, indirect blame hides beneath politeness. It would have been better if. In others, confrontation is considered honesty. But across contexts, the nervous system responds to tone, not content. A gentle phrasing delivered with tension still communicates threat. Our collective lexicon of blame is inherited from parents, institutions, religions, and ideologies. Some learn to weaponize guilt as control, others internalize it as identity. Children who grow up in environments where accountability is met with punishment, not understanding, often learn to deflect instead of reflect. This becomes adult speech. "It wasn't me. I didn't mean to. You're too sensitive." Each phrase is a linguistic echo of early nervous system conditioning, the learned belief that ownership leads to rejection. And yet, the language of repair begins where the language of defense ends. From defense to discernment, to shift from blame to belonging, we must first build the physiological capacity to stay in conversation with discomfort. It's not about stopping blame, it's about recognizing the impulse beneath it. When blame arises, pause. Notice where your attention lands, inward or outward. Observe the muscles around your mouth, the tension in your chest. Then, breathe slowly and reframe the inner monologue. This isn't about fault, it's about fear. That simple shift from accusation to observation activates the prefrontal cortex, rebalancing emotion and logic. The tone naturally softens, the words reorient toward truth. In MLH terms, this is linguistic alchemy, transforming reactive phrasing into reflective language. In NSL, it's somatic co-regulation turning speech into safety. An invitation to ownership accountability is not a moral achievement. It's a nervous system milestone. It requires enough internal safety to say, "Yes, that was me," without collapsing into shame. Ownership is what happens when the body trusts that truth won't destroy connection. That's why the first step toward responsibility isn't confession, it's regulation. You cannot speak truth from a body still braced against consequence. Calm first, then communicate. This is the foundational principle of nervous system language. Tone precedes content. Owning your part doesn't mean self-blame. It means acknowledging your agency without abandoning your compassion. It's learning to hold the mirror steady, to see both the part of you that hurts and the part that's capable of healing. As you listen to this episode, I invite you to soften your listening. Don't rush to label the blamer or the blamed. Instead, notice the rhythm of your breath when you hear accusation, in others or within yourself. Where does your body brace? Where does it want to defend? Let this be a conversation, not a confession. A dialogue between your nervous system and your awareness. Because every time we speak from blame, we reveal something sacred, the place where understanding is still missing. And every time we pause before defending, we create the space where empathy can return. This episode is about that space, the pause between pain and projection, the breath between fear and ownership. Let's decode the language of defense and rediscover the safety and accountability. Blame divides, truth reconnects. The difference is tone. A reflex of defense. Blame as body language before it becomes a sentence. Blame is a sensation. It begins as a contraction, a tightening across the chest, a flash of heat in the sternum, a micro-freeze in the jaw. Something inside says, "I don't feel safe." The nervous system reads the moment as a threat, and before thought can intervene, the body speaks for us. Words sharpen, tone rises, the breath shortens. We don't decide to blame, we react to danger through language. Blame, then, isn't just moral, it's muscular. It's what speech sounds like when safety has left the room. The neurobiology of blame. From a neuropsychological perspective, blame activates the same circuits that fire during physical threat. When we perceive criticism, rejection, or injustice, the amygdala lights up, our brain's alarm system. Within milliseconds, it sends a signal to the hypothalamus, which floods the body with stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol, and norepinephrine. Blood flow diverts from reasoning centers in the prefrontal cortex to the limbs and the vocal apparatus. We are now primed to act rather than reflect. That's why in conflict, the voice tightens or raises. The throat constricts because the vagus nerve is withdrawing from its social engagement branch. We can't sound calm when the body believes it's in danger. What we call defensiveness is the physiological echo of threat. The autonomic nervous system doesn't distinguish between physical and emotional peril, it reacts to both. When someone says, "You let me down," the brain may process it as an attack. And when we hurl back, "You're too demanding," it's our survival circuitry speaking, a linguistic punch thrown to create distance from pain. Every "you" in a blame sentence is a flare fired from the nervous system. Stay away. I'm overwhelmed. Language as a nervous reflex under stress. Language simplifies. Sentences shorten, nuance collapses, and grammar hardens into absolutes. Always, never, every time. This is not a coincidence, it's chemistry. When cortisol surges, the hippocampus, our memory integrator, loses efficiency and linguistic flexibility decreases. We can't access the full lexicon of empathy while the brain is protecting the body. In nervous system language (NSL), we describe this as linguistic narrowing, the reduction of verbal range to match the body's capacity to stay present. A dysregulated body can only speak in binaries. So "you never listen" replaces "I feel unheard." "Why do you always" replaces "something between us feels tense." The first statement transmits survival, the second, vulnerability. The difference is state, not intelligence. The mirror of regulation, the power of mirror talk, lies in recognizing that tone is the first language of safety. Before content, before logic, before meaning, tone tells the truth. When a voice carries tension, the listener's vagus nerve detects it instantly. Their own system shifts toward defense. The loop begins. Two bodies, two brains, each interpreting the other's stress as threat. In this sense, blame is contagious. Through the mechanism of mirror neurons, one person's defensiveness triggers the same defensive state in the other. What starts as a single sharp word becomes an emotional feedback loop, each phrase escalating physiological arousal. You can observe this in everyday exchanges. One person says, "You never help around here." The other replies, "That's not true. I did it yesterday." Neither statement addresses the emotion beneath, the loneliness, the exhaustion, the wish to be seen. Each voice defends its version of reality instead of co-regulating the other's nervous system. The conversation becomes two mirrors reflecting distress. The somatic sequence of blame. If we slow the process down, blame follows a predictable somatic arc, one perceived threat. A word, gesture, or silence activates an old wound, a memory of not being seen or valued. 2. Autonomic activation. The sympathetic system surges, heart rate rises, breath shallows. 3. Cognitive distortion. The mind rushes to create clarity. Someone must be at fault. 4. Linguistic discharge. The emotion seeks exit through accusation. You always, you never, you don't. 5. Post-blame drop. After release, the system relaxes slightly, but guilt or shame may follow. This pattern is self-reinforcing because the body experiences temporary relief after externalizing distress. It feels like control. That relief becomes addictive, forming what psychology calls defensive habituation, a loop in which blame temporarily regulates emotion while reinforcing disconnection. Projection as nervous system outsourcing. Why do we project? Because the brain prefers coherence over chaos. When inner experience feels contradictory, love mixed with anger, compassion mixed with resentment, the nervous system seeks to simplify. Projection resolves internal dissonance by assigning unwanted emotion to an external object. In MLH terms, projection is semantic outsourcing, delegating uncomfortable meaning to someone else's mirror. It's not that we consciously intend harm, it's that our language unconsciously evacuates discomfort. If I say, "You're being selfish," what I might really mean is, I feel afraid to ask for what I need. But my body doesn't yet trust that truth is safe, so it converts vulnerability into accusation. Blame becomes a translation error, the syntax of unspoken fear. The paradox is that while blame pushes others away, it also reveals our deepest wish, to be understood without having to explain ourselves. How the brain builds its case once blame begins, the mind recruits logic to defend it. Neuroscientist Michael Gazzaniga's research on the left hemisphere interpreter shows that the brain is a master storyteller. It generates rational explanations for emotional impulses after the fact. We justify the accusation to maintain coherence. Cognitive dissonance theory supports this. When our behavior conflicts with our self-image, we invent narratives that make them compatible. So the sentence, "I only said that because they were being unfair," is often the interpreter at work, post-rationalizing what the nervous system had already decided. This mechanism explains why apologies can feel difficult. To apologize sincerely, we must override the brain's need for consistency and admit that our survival system spoke first. That the cultural addiction to blame is also systemic. Our media ecosystems reward outrage. Our institutions thrive on scapegoats. Online, every misstep becomes a target, every disagreement a spectacle. This externalization mirrors our inner habits. Collective nervous systems offloading discomfort onto digital others. Algorithms amplify emotional arousal because outrage keeps us engaged. It's no surprise, then, that our personal conversations often mirror the same tone, fast, reactive, polarized. We have normalized dysregulation as dialogue. In the mirror linguistic frame, this is cultural projection, a society externalizing its anxiety through constant moral surveillance. To resist it is to practice linguistic sovereignty, slowing down, choosing nuance, refusing to speak from adrenaline. The most radical act of communication today may simply be staying regulated while disagreeing. From reactivity to responsibility, true accountability begins in the nervous system, not the intellect. We cannot take responsibility while our body is still defending against perceived danger. That's why so many apologies fail. They're cognitive gestures performed by a dysregulated system. The tone betrays the truth. Responsibility in its truest form is regulation embodied. It's the ability to remain open, curious, and grounded enough to examine one's impact without collapsing into shame. From the NSL lens, accountability sounds like slow rhythm, warm tone, forward-leaning empathy, breath before sentence. From the MLH perspective, it reads as mirror restoration, the moment when both parties can see themselves and each other without distortion. When we reach this point, blame transforms from a weapon into a window. The phrase "I'm sorry" ceases to be a defense, it becomes integration. The linguistic anatomy of "I'm sorry" apologies are not merely moral, they're somatic acts of repair. When spoken sincerely, the phrase "I'm sorry" modulates vagal tone in both speaker and listener. The rhythm of the apology, slower, softer, often accompanied by exhalation, signals safety. Neuroscientifically, this triggers oxytocin release, reducing cortisol and increasing trust. But for this to work, the tone must align with the truth. A rushed or performative apology does not create coherence. The nervous system detects incongruence instantly. In the mirror linguistic hypothesis, this is known as semantic dissonance, when words and physiological state contradict each other. The body doesn't believe the sentence, even if the mind does. Authentic accountability requires coherence between thought, tone, and tension. Only then can language re-establish belonging. The rehearsed reflex. It's easy to think that blaming is a moral flaw, but often it's a learned reflex, inherited from how conflict was handled in childhood. If anger was met with punishment, you learn to deflect. If mistakes were shamed, you learn to deny. If silence was safer than truth, you learn to disappear. The body remembers these rules long after the mind forgets. Every you never may carry the echo of a parent's voice, a teacher's tone, or a culture's script. What we call blame might simply be a language we were taught to survive. Healing doesn't come from erasing that language, but from rewriting its rhythm. By slowing down, softening tone, and breathing before words, we give the body a chance to choose a different syntax. Reflection prompt. Pause for a moment and ask yourself, when you blame, whether aloud or silently, what happens in your body? Do you lean forward or pull back? Does your breath tighten or pause? Does your voice rise, quicken, or go flat? Now imagine doing nothing, no defense, no explanation, just noticing. This is what regulation feels like, space between impulse and expression. That space is where empathy begins. Blame is the nervous system's attempt to outsource discomfort, a reflex that protects us from shame, but that's not true, I'm just tired. A here's minimization intensifies the accusation. B withdraws. Both are trapped in mirror dysregulation, their nervous systems reflecting and amplifying threat. If we slow down neurobiologically, here's what's happening. 1. Trigger. A perceives B's quietness. The brain interprets it as potential rejection. 2. Activation. The amygdala floods A's body with cortisol. Fear becomes agitation. 3. Projection. To regulate, A externalises the feeling, turns fear into accusation. 4. Contagion. B's mirror neurons perceive the aggression, triggering sympathetic arousal. 5. Feedback. The argument escalates as both seek relief from the discomfort their bodies created together. Had paused to notice the sensation, tightness in the stomach, breath in the throat, and named it directly. I'm feeling disconnected, can we talk? The feedback loop might never have begun. Projection bypasses vulnerability, but also bypasses repair. The cognitive architecture of projection cognitive psychology offers another lens. Aaron Beck's schema theory describes how we interpret present events through templates formed by past experiences. These schemas, I'm unlovable, people always leave, I must be perfect, act as perceptual filters. When a situation activates a schema, the brain rushes to confirm it. This confirmation bias ensures continuity of identity, but distorts reality. Projection is the linguistic expression of that distortion. Example, a person with an unseen schema might frequently accuse others of ignoring them, even in moments of care. Their nervous system scans for cues of abandonment, interpreting neutral pauses as rejection. Each accusation, though inaccurate, feels protective because it maintains emotional consistency. From the NSL viewpoint, the schema lives not only in cognition but in physiology, in muscle memory, breath pattern, and tone. The body anticipates loss before evidence appears. It literally breathes the story before speaking it. The science of emotional contagion projection is often discussed as a psychological defense, but it's also a neurochemical contagion. When we express anger, Our tone and facial expressions release microsignals that the listener's nervous system translates into their own stress response. Research in effective neuroscience shows that exposure to another's anger increases cortisol and heart rate in the observer within seconds. This means that projection doesn't just communicate, it replicates. Our unprocessed emotion becomes another person's physiological reality. In digital communication, this happens through language markers, all caps, rapid punctuation, sarcasm. Online arguments can raise heart rate and trigger stress responses similar to in-person confrontation, despite the absence of vocal tone. The body responds to perceived intent encoded in symbols. Thus, projection in the digital age has become an amplified nervous system loop, thousands of dysregulated bodies co-regulating through outrage. The nervous system's attempt to discharge discomfort now drives entire algorithms. NSL and MLH in projection. In the combined frameworks of NSL and MLH, projection is the collapse of inner translation. When arousal exceeds awareness, the body's language, tone, rhythm, and tension take control of expression. Meaning becomes distorted because syntax collapses under emotion. From the NSL view, projection is dysregulated tone plus truncated breath. Accountability is regulated tone plus deliberate pacing. From the MLH view, projection is a mirror inversion. We speak from the reflection we fear most. Integration is a mirror correction. We recognize our reflection as our own and speak from ownership. These principles remind us that projection isn't simply miscommunication, it's misperceived embodiment. Why projection feels safer than ownership. Ownership requires stillness. Projection is not a flaw to fix, but a function to understand, a translation glitch between emotion and expression. Projection is the nervous system's attempt to make discomfort visible, to find safety by locating the threat outside. But what happens when we stop outsourcing? When we bring language home to the body that created it? Because once we see projection clearly, a new responsibility arises to repair the conversation it distorted. We've traced how blame and projection distort dialogue, but repair requires a new kind of syntax, one built on awareness, pacing, and tone. In the next part, the linguistics of accountability, the syntax of repair, we'll explore how words rebuild trust when spoken from regulation instead of reflex. The linguistics of accountability, the syntax of repair. Accountability begins where projection ends, not as apology, but as integration. It's what happens when language turns back toward the self, when words stop defending and start describing. To be accountable is not to confess or collapse, it's to stay present in the discomfort of what we've created without rushing to escape it. In nervous system terms, accountability is coherence, alignment between state, speech, and soul. It's what happens when tone, body, and truth finally agree. From blame to balance. If blame is the reflex and projection is the mirror, accountability is the pause between them, the moment awareness enters the system. But to reach it, we have to travel through regulation. The body must believe it's safe enough to stay with complexity. In unregulated states we defend, in regulated states we discern. That's why true accountability can't be forced through guilt or demanded through shame. It requires physiological grounding. When the vagus nerve re-engages, when breath slows, shoulders drop and heart rate steadies, we regain access to the prefrontal cortex, where empathy and reflection live. Only then can we speak the language of repair. From the NSL perspective, this is the shift from sympathetic activation, fight-flight, to ventral vagal engagement, social connection. From the MLH perspective, it's a tonal transition from jagged syntax to rhythmic coherence. Accountability sounds different because it feels different. The sound of safety tone precedes meaning. Before the mind interprets words, the nervous system hears frequency. When someone says, "I'm sorry" with constricted breath, the body of the listener registers tension before content. When the same words are spoken through an exhale, with warmth and rhythm, they are received as genuine repair. This is the foundation of nervous system language. Sound regulates meaning. Research in interpersonal neurobiology shows that the prosodic qualities of speech, rhythm, pitch, and melody are directly linked to vagal tone. Safe communication sounds melodic, not monotone. Aggression flattens rhythm, shame tightens pitch. In MLH, this is known as semantic harmony, the alignment between linguistic rhythm and emotional intention. When the two diverge, trust erodes. The syntax of repair, therefore, isn't just about what we say, but how we sound while saying it. The architecture of an apology accountability has a structure, a kind of emotional grammar. Just as every sentence has a subject, verb, and object, every apology has three essential components: recognition, responsibility, and restoration. 1. Recognition, seeing what occurred without distortion or defense. I see that my words hurt you. This is an acknowledgement without interpretation, the mirror held steady. 2. Responsibility, owning impact without collapsing into guilt. That wasn't my intention, but I understand that's what happened. Here, tone becomes bridge. The nervous system stays open enough to stay relational. 3. Restoration, offering repair without performance. What can I do to help rebuild trust? This re-establishes agency for both parties, turning apology into dialogue. What matters most is congruence, the alignment of language, body, and emotion. When an apology feels performative, it's because congruence is missing. The voice carries the residue of self-protection instead of openness. In Mirror Talk, we call this the dissonant apology, a speech that seeks to end discomfort rather than restore connection. How the brain processes apology. The neuroscience of apology reveals why tone matters. Functional MRI studies show that genuine apologies activate the recipient's ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the region associated with empathy and emotional regulation, while defensive apologies, those containing but or justification, activate the amygdala, sustaining alertness and mistrust. When the brain perceives sincerity, oxytocin and serotonin levels rise, dampening stress responses. This physiological safety enables forgiveness not as a moral choice, but as nervous system synchrony. Thus, repair isn't about persuading the mind, it's about co-regulating the body. In NSL, this is tonal contagion, when calm rhythm entrains another's breathing pattern, synchronizing both nervous systems toward rest. Repair then becomes a physiological duet. The linguistic anatomy of defense. To understand accountability, we must recognize its opposite, defensive syntax. Defense hides in language through small markers, interruptions, qualifiers, deflections, and passive voice. Consider these examples. I'm sorry if you felt that way is a displacement of responsibility. That wasn't what I meant is prioritizing intention over impact. You misunderstood me is redirecting discomfort. I didn't do anything wrong is moralization instead of reflection. Each phrase protects identity at the cost of connection. In MLH terms, this is egoic encryption, the use of linguistic code to preserve self-image. In NSL, it's a nervous contraction, the physical tightening that corresponds to threat perception. To dismantle defensive syntax, we must expand the body first. Slow the breath, uncross the arms, relax the jaw. Language follows posture. Posture follows safety. When the body softens, sentences elongate. The voice lowers, rhythm returns. This is how grammar becomes grace. The accountability spectrum. Accountability isn't binary. It exists on a spectrum. At one end lies avoidance, denial, minimization, projection. At the other, over-accountability, collapsing into guilt, assuming blame for everything, apologizing excessively. Both are dysregulated states. Avoidance is a sympathetic defense, outward aggression to preserve safety. Over-accountability is dorsal collapse, inward withdrawal to preserve belonging. In both cases, tone betrays imbalance. The avoidance speaks with tension. The over-accountable speaks with breathless softness. True accountability lives in the middle, grounded, measured, and clear. It's the sound of an integrated nervous system. In MLH, this is linguistic neutrality, a tone that neither inflates nor diminishes selfhood. It communicates "I am here" without saying "I am right." Why guilt and shame hijack language? To speak with accountability, we must separate guilt from shame. Guilt says, "I did something wrong." Shame says, "I'm wrong." Guilt motivates repair. Shame motivates withdrawal. Neuroscientifically, guilt activates the prefrontal cortex, encouraging empathy and problem-solving, whereas shame activates the posterior cingulate and insula, regions tied to self-conscious pain. That's why shaming language, "you should be ashamed," "how could you," rarely inspires change. It triggers collapse rather than reflection. In our own speech, the moment shame enters, the syntax of repair dissolves. Sentences shorten, voice trembles, eye contact breaks. The nervous system retreats into protection. This is why self-compassion is not indulgence, it's a prerequisite. Without it, accountability curdles into self-attack. Cultural scripts of responsibility. Each culture teaches a different dialect of accountability. Some prioritize collective harmony, apologies as a social ritual rather than personal reflection. Others elevate individualism, sincerity measured by emotional expression. In hierarchical cultures, accountability may signal weakness. In egalitarian ones, strength. Gender also shapes syntax. Research shows that women are statistically more likely to over-apologize due to social conditioning linking care with guilt, while men, conditioned to equate vulnerability with loss of status, may under-apologize. Neither extreme fosters repair. Both reveal the intersection of culture and nervous system, learned postures of protection masquerading as communication. Mirror Talk invites us to create a third language, accountability as relational regulation, a language not of power or submission, but of coherence. The linguistics of repair in practice. To integrate accountability linguistically, we can follow a three-phase model. Locate to translate to regulate. 1. Locate, identify the bodily state before speaking. Is my body tense or relaxed? Where is my breath? This determines the tone of truth. 2. Translate, convert emotional charge into descriptive language. Instead of "I didn't mean it," try "I can see that my words landed differently than I intended." Replace defense with description. 3. Regulate, adjust tempo and prosody to sustain openness. Speak slower than usual. Leave pauses for listening. Let tone demonstrate sincerity rather than argument. This triadic model mirrors the nervous system's own rhythm: awareness, sensory, cognition, translation, regulation, integration. When applied consistently, it rewires conversational reflexes into conscious syntax. The mirror in dialogue: every act of repair is also a mirror exercise. When we own our impact, we're not simply restoring trust, we're correcting our reflection in another's nervous system. MLH describes communication as a series of reciprocal reflections. Each sentence shapes perception, tone, and safety in both directions. When we take accountability, we recalibrate the mirror, clearing the distortions created by projection or defense. This is not just emotional, it's physiological. The listener's nervous system shifts from vigilance to receptivity. The bridge reappears. A regulated "I understand" can unwind hours of tension created by an unregulated "you should." How accountability restores narrative integrity: projection fractures narrative coherence. Our story of what happened becomes fragmented by self-protection. Accountability reunites the fragments. By acknowledging our role, we integrate multiple perspectives into one truthful storyline. This activates the hippocampus, which supports memory consolidation and strengthens the brain's capacity for future empathy. In MLH, this process restores semantic integrity, the alignment of internal story with external speech. When words match reality, the nervous system relaxes. Truth feels safe because it is no longer split. The inner dialogue of accountability. We often think of accountability as interpersonal, but it begins intrapersonally. How do we speak to ourselves after we make a mistake? Is our tone punitive or patient? Self-talk reveals our internal syntax of repair. If the inner voice says, "You're such an idiot," the nervous system contracts. Shame replaces curiosity. If the voice says, "That was painful, but I can learn from it," the body stays regulated, enabling reflection. Through MLH, we might call this mirror internalization, the way external linguistic tone becomes the template for inner speech. The more we practice gentle accountability with ourselves, the easier it becomes to speak it with others. A case study: the workplace conflict. Consider a workplace scenario. A manager, under pressure, raises their voice at a team member. Later they feel uneasy but defensive. "I was just stressed." If the manager approaches the conversation without regulation, they might say, "I'm sorry if you took that personally. I didn't mean it that way." This is a displacement apology, deflective, maintaining control. The employee's body hears tension, not sincerity. Now imagine the same scenario with regulation. The manager pauses, breathes, and notices the guilt as a sensation rather than a narrative. They approach again. "I realize my tone earlier was sharp. That wasn't fair. I was stressed, but that's not an excuse. I imagine it might have felt unsafe. I'd like to make sure that doesn't happen again." Same event, different nervous system. The second apology restores safety because it includes recognition, ownership, and relational intention. The body tone and words match. That's accountability as repair, not performance. The subtle power of pausing. One of the most profound tools of accountability is silence, not the defensive kind, but the intentional pause, the breath before response. This moment allows the nervous system to downshift and the mind to process. It signals humility: I'm listening, not preparing to speak. In conversation, these pauses recalibrate rhythm. They transform dialogue from debate into synchrony. In MLH, we call this linguistic pacing, allowing relational space for meaning to settle before adding more sound. Silence becomes a kind of punctuation, the comma that keeps conversation breathable. Accountability as nervous system literacy. At its deepest level, accountability is an act of nervous system literacy, reading the signals of threat and safety, both in ourselves and in others, and responding with awareness rather than reflex. Every "I'm sorry" spoken from calm breath rewires the nervous system towards safety and truth. Every "I understand" spoken through a softened tone restores coherence between language and body. This is what the mirror linguistic hypothesis ultimately teaches. Words are not neutral. They are extensions of regulation. Language is physiology given syntax. Reflection prompt. Pause here and bring someone to mind, a moment when repair felt impossible, when words failed, or when defensiveness took over. Ask yourself, what was my body trying to protect at that moment? How did my tone shape the other person's response? If I could slow the conversation down now, what would I say differently, not to change the past, but to honor the truth? Let your answers emerge not from thought, but from breath. Accountability doesn't live in intellect, it lives in tempo. It's the rhythm of honesty meeting compassion. Accountability begins as regulation, but matures through compassion. It isn't simply the act of taking responsibility. It's the nervous system learning to hold guilt without collapsing into shame, to stay relational while acknowledging harm. Because beneath every defensive sentence lies an older story: the need to be seen as good, the fear of being seen as bad. Guilt and shame are the emotional currencies of belonging. One repairs, the other erases. When guilt is met with empathy, it becomes moral alignment. When shame meets judgment, it becomes exile. And our language, its tone, timing, and rhythm, decides which way it goes, From an NSL perspective, the tone of remorse is biochemical. The softened voice, the slower exhale, the downward modulation of rhythm, all of it activates oxytocin and reopens connection. From the MLH view, guilt becomes a mirror of visibility restored, while shame distorts reflection into self-rejection. This is the next frontier of accountability, not the act, but the effect, how we metabolize guilt and transmute shame into compassion. Because repair is never purely cognitive, it's an emotional ecology, a living system that thrives only where safety circulates. Now we move deeper into the emotional terrain that breathes beneath accountability itself, guilt and shame. In the next part, Psychological Insight, the ecology of guilt and shame, will explore how remorse and compassion reshape the nervous system, why shame isolates while guilt connects, and how tone can become medicine when spoken through awareness rather than fear. Psychological Insight. The ecology of guilt and shame are often spoken of together, as if they are twin emotions, born of the same impulse to make wrongs right. But beneath the surface, they live in entirely different climates. Guilt is relational, it seeks repair. Shame is existential, it seeks disappearance. One opens the body, the other closes it. One whispers, "You can do better." The other hisses, "You are the problem." To understand blame and to outgrow it, we must learn to hear the subtle difference in tone between the two. Every nervous system at its core is a soundscape of belonging, and guilt and shame are its competing melodies. The emotional ecology imagine emotion not as a sequence but as an ecosystem, a web of signals that sustain psychological equilibrium. In this ecology, guilt acts like rainfall. It nourishes empathy, prompting growth after disruption. Shame, however, behaves like drought. It dries the connection, leaving roots brittle and isolated. When guilt is metabolized, it becomes moral learning. When shame accumulates, it becomes moral paralysis. The ecology of guilt and shame is about how these emotions circulate through our nervous systems, shaping the microclimate of relationships, who feels safe to approach, who retreats, who disappears behind politeness or anger. This ecology isn't fixed. It changes with tone, language, and memory, with how we interpret the eyes that once watched us. Neurobiology of moral emotion neuroscience paints a clear distinction between guilt and shame at the level of brain activation. Guilt primarily engages the prefrontal cortex, regions responsible for empathy, reflection, and decision-making. It's a social emotion focused on behavior and its impact. Shame, conversely, lights up the posterior cingulate, insular, and amygdala, areas associated with self-conscious pain, disgust, and threat perception. This explains why guilt motivates action. I need to fix this, while shame provokes retreat. I can't face them. From a nervous system lens, guilt lives in the ventral vagal circuit, the social engagement system that allows us to stay present under stress. Shame activates dorsal vagal shutdown, the freeze state, where disconnection becomes safety. This is why shame feels like disappearance. The body literally withdraws from relational space. And yet, most of us were raised in environments that confused the two, taught that shame was moral correction rather than emotional collapse. Parental and cultural transmission. As children, our first moral language wasn't words, it was tone. The widening of a parent's eyes, the disappointed sigh, the clipped, "What did you just do?" These microsignals encoded early associations. Warm tone plus correction leads to guilt, and I did something wrong, but I'm still safe. Cold tone plus withdrawal leads to shame, and I am wrong, and safety is gone. Our nervous systems memorized these combinations long before we could form abstract moral ideas. Some families regulated guilt with compassion. "You broke it, but we can fix it together." Others wielded shame as control. "You always ruin everything." By adulthood, these tonal patterns become self-talk. We police ourselves with inherited syntax. In NSL terms, shame becomes a linguistic residue, a phrase or tone lodged in the body that replays under pressure. In MLH, it's a mirror distortion, the reflection of parental disappointment frozen in language, replayed every time we falter. That's why many adults still hear a parental echo when they make a mistake, even in silence. The voice may have gone, but the prosody remains. The moral landscape, guilt as compass, shame as cage. Guilt is a compass. It points toward the value that was breached and invites restoration. Shame is a cage. It locks the entire self in punishment without parole. Brené Brown distinguishes the two clearly. Guilt says, "I did something bad." Shame says, "I am bad," yet in practice the boundary blurs. Societies that moralize through humiliation, public shaming, ridicule, and religious condemnation condition people to confuse conscience with self-loathing. When guilt becomes contaminated by shame, repair is replaced by performance. We apologize for not reconnecting, but to cleanse. Apologies become ablutions, ritual self-erasure masquerading as virtue. This isn't morality, it's emotional exile. True morality emerges when guilt retains its tether to empathy, not fear. Compassion, as countercurrent psychologist Paul Gilbert, in his work on compassion-focused therapy, argues that shame thrives in threat-based emotion regulation systems. The antidote, therefore, isn't discipline but soothing, activating the parasympathetic state where connection feels safe. When compassion enters, shame dissolves. Not because the mistake disappears, but because the nervous system stops bracing for punishment. Neuroimaging supports this. Self-compassion practices increase activation in the insular and anterior cingulate cortex, regions linked to emotional integration. These same regions deactivate during self-criticism. In NSL, compassion literally changes tone. Breath slows, resonance deepens, and vocal rhythm smooths. In MLH, compassion realigns mirrors, transforming visibility from surveillance to safety. To speak compassionately to oneself after failure is not indulgence, it's nervous system recalibration. Bandura's lens. Moral disengagement. Psychologist Albert Bandura described moral disengagement, the cognitive process by which people justify harmful acts, detaching moral consequences from their identity. This is blame's intellectual cousin. When shame feels unbearable, the mind often escapes responsibility through rationalization. It wasn't that bad. Everyone does it. They deserved it. These linguistic maneuvers deactivate guilt, allowing the body temporary relief, but they also prevent growth. In MLH terms, this is mirror disconnection, the severing of linguistic feedback loops that would otherwise reflect moral consequence. In NSL, it's tone anesthesia, the flattening of emotional resonance to avoid self-confrontation. To re-engage morally, the nervous system must learn to tolerate guilt without self-annihilation. Guilt metabolized through safety becomes conscience. Tone as moral regulator. The nervous system doesn't differentiate between moral and physical safety. It processes both through tone. When remorse is expressed in a soft, grounded voice, it activates oxytocin, the neurochemical of trust and bonding. This is why certain apologies or acknowledgements bring tears to both speaker and listener. The tone itself becomes reparative. Conversely, a defensive or clipped tone keeps cortisol elevated, maintaining distance even when the words appear conciliatory. NSL reminds us remorse has a frequency. From an NSL standpoint, this is somatic completion, the nervous system finishing a loop it once froze within. From MLH, it's linguistic reauthoring, rewriting the sentence of self-identity from I was wrong to I learned. Forgiveness, therefore, is a linguistic act as much as an emotional one. Practice. The compassion reframe, try this simple linguistic and somatic exercise. 1. Recall a moment that triggers guilt or shame. 2. Breathe into the sensation instead of analyzing it. 3. Speak aloud a phrase of compassion. I can hold this with kindness. I understand why I did that then. I still deserve to grow. 4. Observe the bodily shift, a sigh, warmth, loosening. This is guilt transforming through compassion. The tone of the phrase matters more than its words. Gentle rhythm rewires biology. The social function of vulnerability. When someone admits fault without self-condemnation, it creates permission for collective healing. This is social co-regulation, a group nervous system rebalancing through empathy. Public accountability spoken in shame-free language can restore communal trust more effectively than punishment. It models repair as shared humanity rather than hierarchy. This principle underlies restorative justice, trauma-informed teaching, and conscious communication movements. In each, language becomes ecosystemic. The health of one mirror affects them all. Reflection prompt. Sit with these questions, slowly, allowing breath between them. When I feel guilt, can I let it guide me without letting it define me? When shame arises, whose approval am I still chasing? Which tones, from parents, teachers, partners, still echo in my self-talk? What phrase might bring gentleness where judgment once lived? Notice what happens in your body as you answer. Do your shoulders rise or fall? Does your breath deepen or shorten? The answers are the physiological truth. Once guilt transforms into compassion, repair replaces defense. And when the nervous system learns that truth doesn't equal danger, language becomes a bridge again. Because responsibility, at its highest form, is not punishment, it's presence. It's the body saying, I can stay here and face this. In the next part, the responsibility ritual, we'll take these insights into practice. We'll translate blame into ownership through structured reflection, embodied tone, and somatic awareness. Because every act of responsibility is not just moral, it's neurological. Coherence restored through truth spoken calmly. The responsibility is often imagined as weight, something heavy that we carry alone. But when understood through the nervous system, responsibility becomes alignment. It's what happens when guilt finds its grounding, when the body no longer flees from truth, but stands in it with steadiness. This part turns insight into practice, a ritual for restoring coherence where blame once lived. Because responsibility is not moral performance, it's physiological integrity. The body before the story, before any words are spoken, the body declares its state. An unregulated apology feels like bracing, quick, tight, mechanical. A regulated apology feels like grounding, slower, rhythmic, sincere. NSL reminds us that the nervous system must go first. The ritual begins not with confession, but with breath. Take 2 slow inhalations through the nose. Exhale longer than you inhale. Let the shoulders drop. Let the eyes soften. Now speak. I can stay present with this. This single phrase begins recalibration. The body starts believing that truth won't destroy it. The sequence of responsibility, in its truest form, follows 4 stages: identify, to translate, to speak, and to regulate. Each mirrors a shift in the nervous system from reaction to coherence. 1. Identify the blame loop. Notice the recurring sentences that rise in tension. They made me. If they hadn't, this always happens to me. These are linguistic defense mechanisms, verbal reflexes that shield the ego from discomfort. In MLH, we call them deflective mirrors, phrases that redirect reflection outward to preserve the image. To identify the loop, pause mid-sentence and ask, what emotion am I avoiding owning right now? Anger, sadness, embarrassment, fear. Each hides beneath a layer of linguistic armor. An SL practice. Place your hand on your sternum as you name the emotion aloud. This tactile cue anchors awareness in the body, interrupting automatic speech. 2. Translate the reaction into ownership. Once you've identified the emotion, shift from translation reaction. Instead of, they made me feel small, try, I felt small when that happened. This small linguistic pivot rewires the nervous system from threat to self-awareness. It changes the syntax from blame, external cause, to emotion, internal response. Translation is the moment the mirror clears. MLH calls this semantic ownership, transforming perception into agency. The sentence structure itself carries a different physiological signature. The subject moves from they to I. Repeat it slowly until your tone sounds calm rather than charged. That's the sound of ownership settling in. 3. Speak the truth aloud, calmly. The voice is the final bridge between emotion and integration. In NSL, speaking aloud is not just articulation. It's neural anchoring, the body encoding a new reality through vibration. When you speak truth aloud with a steady tone and rhythmic breathing, your vagus nerve receives the message that safety and honesty can coexist. Examples of accountable language. I see how my reaction added tension. I spoke from fear instead of clarity. I missed the impact my words had. I can acknowledge that now. Each statement carries 3 ingredients: self-awareness, calm tempo, and relational intention. Contrast that with reactive phrasing. You're too sensitive. I didn't mean it like that. I was just stressed. The first group regulates the connection. The second severs it. The difference isn't moral. The nervous system recognizes harmony or dissonance before the mind interprets meaning. 4. Regulate the feedback. After speaking the truth, don't rush to seek forgiveness or reassurance. Pause. Let silence complete the circuit. Notice what your body does in that pause. Does your breath tighten again? Do you want to explain further? Do you feel heat, flutter, or tremor? These sensations are residual activation, the nervous system testing the safety of exposure. Rather than suppress them, stay curious. Say internally, I can hold this. Then exhale again. This is how accountability becomes regulation instead of collapse. In time, these micro-pauses recondition the nervous system to associate truth with stability rather than shame. The physiology of responsibility. When responsibility is integrated rather than imposed, it shows up in body language. Posture upright yet relaxed, voice modulated. Facial muscles are soft. These aren't affectations, they're indicators of ventral vagal engagement. In simple terms, your body believes you can face consequences without losing connection. Neuropsychologically, this state corresponds with the activation of prefrontal regulation networks, enabling perspective taking and empathy. The system moves from protection to presence. The phrase "I was wrong and I can repair" becomes not a humiliation, but a declaration of coherence. The ritual as daily practice. You don't need a grand event or confrontation to practice this ritual. It can begin quietly, in the small moments of tension that thread through each day. When you catch yourself blaming, pause, breathe, locate the emotion, and translate it aloud. When you catch yourself over-owning, notice where the guilt becomes self-punishment. Return to breath. Reframe with compassion. Example reframes: it's my responsibility, not my identity. I can correct without collapsing. Repair doesn't mean I'm bad, it means I'm capable. Repetition converts insight into a neural habit. Each phrase, when spoken gently, imprints a new linguistic reflex into your nervous system. That's the long-term aim of NSL, to make self-regulation fluent. Journaling cue. The truth beneath blame. Use this journaling sequence to accompany the ritual. 1. Write down one recurring blame statement, the sentence you return to when triggered. 2. Beneath it write, what truth does this blame protect? 3. Sit quietly and let your body answer before your mind does. 4. Write what arises, even if it feels raw or illogical. You may find something unexpected: fear of abandonment, longing for validation, or grief for being unseen. Blame is often grief wearing armor. Writing this way externalizes the emotion, allowing the prefrontal cortex to metabolize it instead of looping through the limbic system. This is why writing works. It converts implicit emotion into explicit narrative. It moves energy from chaos to coherence. Reflection prompt. Pause for a moment. Think of one relationship where blame still lingers, spoken or silent. Ask, What part of this situation am I still protecting through defense? What truth have I not yet said to them or to myself? If I whispered that truth calmly, what would shift in my body? Listen not for words, but for breath. If your exhale lengthens, the body has accepted the question. That is a responsibility beginning to root. Integration through repetition responsibility becomes ritual through repetition, not revelation. Each time you catch yourself moving from blame to ownership, you reinforce a neural pathway of coherence. At first, it may feel awkward, like learning a new language. That's because, in a sense, you are. The nervous system speaks fluently in repetition. Tone and phrasing become its grammar. The more you speak accountability with a calm rhythm, the more your body associates honesty with safety. In time, your tone will shift automatically. That's when you know the practice has become physiology, when repair is reflex. Reflection prompt. What happens to my breath when I own my part? Answer this not with analysis, but with noticing. Do you feel lighter, steadier, or uneasy? If the body contracts, breathe slower. If it releases, repeat the phrase softly. Awareness is the bridge between insight and embodiment. Responsibility regulates because truth restores coherence. But words alone can't complete the process. The body must participate. For language to heal, the posture that delivers it must align. The next stage isn't about saying more, but about standing differently. In the next part, the posture of ownership, will explore how the body itself becomes the language of sincerity. Through micro-expression, breath, and physical alignment, we'll see that sometimes the most honest apology isn't spoken, it's shown. The posture of ownership words may open the door to repair, but the body decides whether the room feels safe enough to enter. Even the most eloquent apology can collapse under a tense jaw or an averted gaze. Before language was born, we spoke in postures, in breath, eyes, shoulders, and silence. When the body aligns with truth, it becomes a bridge. When it resists, it becomes a barrier. Ownership, then, is not only a moral act but a physical one. It's the nervous system saying, I can stay open even in discomfort. The body as moral instrument, every emotion has a posture. Shame folds forward, rounding the shoulders, collapsing the chest to protect the heart. Guilt steadies the gaze. It wants to re-engage, to make amends. Defensiveness leans back or crosses arms. Humility leans slightly forward. These are not affectations. They are autonomic patterns. They arise from deep circuitry linking emotion and movement, the same neural highways that coordinate survival. In NSL terms, the body's alignment is the first and most accurate translation of internal state. In MLH, posture is pre-linguistic grammar, the syntax of sincerity before speech. When the body contradicts the words, listeners instinctively feel unease. It's why we can sense insincerity even when tone and vocabulary seem appropriate. The body tells the truth the voice avoids. Physiological congruence. To embody ownership, the body must signal two things simultaneously. The somatic arc of ownership unfolds through the body in three arcs. Tension leads to awareness and then release. 1. Tension arises as the system anticipates a threat. Muscles brace, breath shortens, gaze narrows. 2. Awareness enters through interoception, noticing without judgment. 3. Release follows when the body realizes safety persists even as truth is spoken. This triphasic process mirrors trauma resolution. The body learns that correction doesn't equal danger. It's moral maturation at the level of the vagus nerve. When practiced often, this embodied coherence becomes the new baseline for authenticity. Reflection prompt. Pause here and scan your body. Where do you hold tension when you feel accused or ashamed? What happens to your breath when you admit fault? How do your shoulders, chest, and throat respond? Now imagine standing before someone you've hurt, but this time, your only task is to breathe evenly and meet their eyes without speaking. Notice what that silence does. Ownership isn't always verbal. Sometimes it's the courage to remain visible. Integration, embodied ownership, creates moral resonance. It shows others and yourself that accountability is not self-erasure, but presence under pressure. Through repeated practice, this posture of ownership becomes a template the body returns to instinctively. It transforms apology from performance into regulation, from guilt into growth. This is the nervous system's version of integrity. No contradiction between what is said, what is felt, and what is shown. Once the body aligns with truth, reconciliation begins. Because coherence doesn't demand perfection, only congruence. Accountability and belonging. The next step in the journey is belonging. How accountability ripples outward into connection. How the self that once blamed now becomes a bridge. In the final part of the episode, From Blame to Belonging, we'll trace the full arc of this episode, from projection to presence, from defense to intimacy. We'll explore how accountability becomes trust, and how ownership embodied, spoken, and felt is the foundation of belonging. From blame to belonging. There's a quiet moment that arrives after the apology, after the explanations, after the breath, when there's nothing left to defend. That's the threshold of belonging. It doesn't arrive because everything was said perfectly. It arrives because the nervous system finally stops scanning for threat. because the truth, once terrifying, now sits gently between two people and doesn't burn anymore. Blame has dissolved. Ownership has settled. Connection begins again, not as it was, but as it could be. The arc of return, every emotional rupture, moves through 4 invisible stages. Projection leads to awareness, which leads to accountability and repair. Belonging is the 5th stage, the echo after the echo. It's the point where both bodies, both minds, realize that difference doesn't mean danger, and accountability doesn't mean shame. It's the natural end state of nervous system regulation, the restoration of co-regulation. In the language of NSL, belonging is mutual regulation. The breath, tone, and tempo between two people find rhythm again. In MLH, it's mirror realignment, both parties seeing each other without distortion. Blame fractures that rhythm, ownership restores it. And belonging, the deep, wordless sense of we're okay, is the body's exhale after truth. From projection to presence, blame begins as projection, an unconscious attempt to discharge inattention by externalizing it. When shame or fear becomes unbearable, the psyche seeks relief by locating the problem outside itself. Projection, neurologically, is a short circuit of empathy. The brain's mirror systems dim, the amygdala and default mode network dominate. The mind narrates self-protection instead of self-awareness, but ownership reactivates empathy. By bringing attention back into the body, we reopen the mirror systems, literally reactivating the capacity to feel another's humanity. In practice, that shift looks like this: from you made me feel, to I felt hurt when, from you never listened to, I need to feel heard right now, from you're impossible to, I'm struggling to understand you. This is the grammar of belonging, self-referenced, grounded, relational. Each phrase is a micro-act of presence, signaling the nervous system that safety and truth can coexist. The paradox of accountability, true belonging, doesn't arise from perfection. It grows from accountable imperfection, because it's only when we can admit failure without fleeing that trust becomes embodied. Accountability in this sense isn't moral self-flagellation, it's emotional reliability. It says, you can count on me to remain in truth, even when I'm uncomfortable. Neuroscience supports this. When individuals express accountability calmly, the listener's amygdala activity decreases and oxytocin increases, facilitating relational repair. Our biology rewards humility. In NSL terms, accountability generates coherence, synchronizing internal and external states through tone and gesture. In MLH, it's linguistic symmetry, the mirror cleansed of projection. This is the paradox. The more we admit fallibility, the more trustworthy we become. The physiology of in NSL sessions, these patterns are often the first indicators of relational healing. Shoulders squared but relaxed, gaze open, tempo of dialogue slowed. The conversation feels less like negotiation, more like rhythm. Belonging is rhythm remembered. From blame to belonging, the reframing process. Every movement away from blame begins as a physiological shift before it becomes a linguistic one. What the mouth speaks, the body first feels. The journey from projection to belonging unfolds through 5 natural stages, each marked by a change in both language and nervous system state. We begin in projection. This is the state of defense, where the body interprets disagreement as danger. The inner dialogue sounds like, it's their fault, or they always do this. Here, the sympathetic nervous system is active, heart rate rises, tone sharpens, and speech quickens. The purpose of projection isn't malice, it's self-protection. But the cost is disconnection. The first step toward repair begins when we recognize this reflex and gently shift the phrasing. Instead of it's their fault, try, I'm triggered by this situation. That small adjustment signals awareness to the body and starts to ease the fight or flight response. The second stage is awareness. The body is no longer fighting, but still alert. The tone softens slightly as self-observation emerges. Thoughts become, I'm reacting, or I can notice my pattern. This mid-regulated state is where curiosity re-enters the system. Awareness doesn't demand immediate change. It simply names what's happening. Each sentence said with gentleness creates distance between emotion and identification. Next comes accountability. Here, regulation increases, the breath steadies, and the prefrontal cortex regains its role in decision-making. The language shifts from blame to ownership. I played a part, or here's what I can own. This phrasing activates the ventral vagal system, the social engagement branch of the parasympathetic nervous system, inviting connection and humility. Accountability isn't self-blame, it's self-regulation in motion. Once accountability is established, we move into repair. The nervous system opens toward co-regulation, the mutual dance of safety. Words now sound like, let's reconnect, or can we start again? The tone carries warmth and a willingness to be met. Physiologically, oxytocin rises, heart rhythms synchronize, and both bodies begin to settle into relational safety. Finally, we reach belonging, the state of synchrony and shared safety. Language here becomes inclusive, reflective, and calm. The phrases shift toward, we're learning, or I'm glad we stayed. In this phase, the nervous system fully relaxes into connection. Belonging is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of repair, The body remembering it can remain in relationship even after rupture. When spoken sequentially, these stages trace a living grammar of reconciliation. Projection speaks from fear, awareness observes, accountability grounds. Repair reaches out, belonging breathes. Each stage teaches the body a new tone, and together they form the nervous system's quiet lesson. Safety is not the end of conflict, but the return to connection. Each stage represents both a linguistic and biological recalibration, from survival to connection. In practice, moving from blame to belonging is not a single step, but a sequence of regulated conversations, both internal and external. Practice, the bridge breath. Here's a simple practice to embody belonging through rhythm. 1. Sit comfortably with your spine upright and feet grounded. 2. Inhale for a count of 4, feel expansion through the chest. 3. Pause briefly, then exhale for a count of 6. 4. As you exhale, imagine sending warmth outward like a slow bridge of breath. 5. Silently repeat, I can meet others from calm. Now picture someone with whom you've experienced conflict. Instead of replaying the argument, visualize the rhythm of your breath connecting with theirs, not agreement, but attunement. You're training your nervous system to tolerate difference while staying open. This is the physiological practice of belonging. Reflection prompt. Take a quiet moment for reflection. What does belonging feel like in your body? Warmth, expansion, relief, ease. How do you know when you're slipping back into blame, tightening, shallow breathing, mental narration? Who in your life helps your nervous system regulate just by how they listen? And perhaps most importantly, do you allow yourself to belong, or do you keep earning it? Breathe with the question. Belonging begins not with permission, but with presence. The collective ripple. Every act of personal accountability contributes to collective coherence. When one person stops blaming and starts owning, the emotional tone of an environment changes. Group dynamics, families, and even workplaces all operate as shared nervous systems. A single regulated tone can stabilize the entire field. In MLH, this is known as mirror contagion, the way sincerity spreads through tone and body language faster than persuasion. In NSL, it's co-regulatory resonance, the physiology of peace shared through breath and sound. This is how belonging scales, not through ideology, but through resonance. Each calm voice becomes a tuning fork for others to match. Affirmation owning my part isn't a weakness, it's trust in my capacity to grow. Say it slowly. Notice what shifts in your chest, in your spine. If it feels warm, that's belonging beginning to anchor. Belonging doesn't end with resolution. It evolves through continued awareness. Because once blame is disarmed, subtler patterns surface, the unspoken rules, the emotional contracts we never consciously agreed to, but still obey. That's where we go next. Episode 13, Unspoken Rules. After blame comes the quieter architecture of control, the implicit expectations, invisible permissions, and silent codes that shape how we love, work, and stay small. In the next episode, we'll decode these hidden grammars of belonging and learn how to rewrite them. As we come to the end of the episode, speak not to win, but to understand. That's where blame ends and belonging begins. Until next time, thank you for joining me today. You've been listening to Mirror Talk, the language of the nervous system. I'm James Miller.